The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a silver light over the slavers' camp. Shadows of tall trees loomed around the clearing, their branches whispering in the wind as if the forest itself was watching. A beak crouched behind a thick bush, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. Beside her, Kwame clutched the spear tightly, his face hard with determination. "They have Ofori in that cage," Kwame whispered, pointing to a wooden pen guarded by two men with rifles slung over their shoulders. Inside, a beak could see figures huddled together, some crying softly, others silent with despair. Her brother was among them, his small form pressed against the bars, eyes closed. A beak swallowed hard. "We'll get him out," she whispered, though her hands trembled. "We'll get all of them out." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a pouch filled with a mixture of herbs she'd ground into powder earlier. The herbs weren't just for healing. They were also dangerous when used the right way. She had spent the last few days testing and perfecting the blend, and now it was time to put her plan into action. Kwame and Abik waited until the slavers' laughter filled the air. A fire burned brightly in the center of the camp, and the men were eating, drinking, and boasting about their profits. They also have ladies dancing and sitting on their lap. Captain Drake sat apart from the others, sharpening his blade, his cold eyes scanning the camp like a predator watching its prey. Abik's fingers brushed against the baobab leaf tied to her belt, a talisman from her village for strength. She focused on its smooth texture, grounding herself. "Now," she whispered. Kwame moved like a shadow, circling the camp to where the guards had stacked their food supplies. Abik followed close behind, her heart racing. The guards were distracted by their own laughter, the firelight dancing in their eyes as they refilled their cups with stolen wine. Abik worked quickly. She sprinkled the powdered herbs into a pot of stew that sat simmering over a smaller fire. The smell of roasted meat wafted through the air, masking the faint bitter scent of the poison. Her hands moved swiftly but silently, her ears straining for any sign she'd been caught. Kwame kept watch, his spear ready, his sharp eyes darting between the guards and the camp. When they were done, they melted back into the shadows, holding their breath. Abik clenched her fists, praying to the spirits of her ancestors. "Please," she murmured under her breath, "let this work." Minutes felt like hours as the poisoned stew was ladled into bowls and handed around. The slavers laughed and jeered, toasting to their spoils as they dug into their meals. It didn't take long for the first coughs to start. One man clutched his stomach, his bowl clattering to the ground. Another staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunkard before collapsing near the fire. Captain Drake noticed the commotion immediately. "What's going on here?" he barked, standing up, his sharp eyes scanning the camp. But even as he shouted, more of his men began to fall. Some groaned in pain. Others simply slumped over, unconscious. Abik took her chance. She darted toward the cage, her movements quick and quiet. "Ofori," she hissed. Her brother's eyes snapped open, and relief flooded his face. "Abik," he whispered, tears glistening in his eyes. The lock on the cage was sturdy, but Abik had prepared for this too. She pulled out a small vial of acid she'd made from crushed plants and minerals. Carefully, she poured it over the lock, watching as it sizzled and smoked. The lock gave way with a soft click, and the cage door swung open. "Come on," she urged, grabbing Ofori's hand. "Everyone, follow me." The captives hesitated, their faces a mix of hope and fear. But when Kwame appeared out of the darkness, his spear held high, they moved. One by one, they slipped out of the cage, staying low and silent as they followed Abik and Kwame toward the trees. Just as the last captive stepped into the forest, a shout rang out behind them. "Stop them!" Captain Drake's voice cut through the night like a blade. He had spotted them, and though his men were weakened, a few were still strong enough to stumble after the fleeing villagers. Abik froze as Drake stormed toward her, his sword glinting in the moonlight. "You think you can outsmart me, girl?" he sneered, his voice full of menace. You will pay for this. Fear coursed through Abik's veins, but she stood her ground, clutching the empty vial in her hand. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. You'll pay for what you've done. Drake lunged at her, but Kwame intercepted him, his spear clashing against the captain's sword. The two men fought fiercely, the sound of metal ringing through the air. Abik couldn't look away, her breath caught in her throat. Then she saw it, a vine trailing along the ground, thick and sturdy. An idea sparked in her mind. While Drake was focused on Kwame, Abik darted forward and grabbed the vine. With all her strength, she looped it around Drake's ankle and pulled. The captain lost his balance, crashing to the ground with a roar of anger. Run, Abik, Kwame shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Abik didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ofori's hand and led the captives deeper into the forest, the sounds of the slavers fading behind them, the trees closing around them, their branches like protective arms shielding the group from harm. By the time they stopped, dawn was breaking, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink. The group collapsed in a clearing, exhausted but free. Abik sank to her knees, pulling Ofori into a tight embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, sobbing softly. You did it, Kwame said, his voice rough but full of admiration. He leaned on his spear, blood trickling from a small cut on his arm. You saved them. Abik looked around at the freed villagers, their faces weary but hopeful. She thought of the baobab tree back home, its roots deep and unshakable. We saved them, she corrected, her voice firm. Together, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile. The morning sun painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold as the villagers trudged back to the remnants of their home. Their feet were sore, their bodies weary, but their hearts carried a spark that could not be extinguished. The spark of freedom. Abik walked at the front of the group, her hands tightly holding her brother Ofori's. His small fingers gripped hers as though letting go might sweep him away again. He was quiet, but the fear in his eyes had started to fade, replaced by a fragile hope. As they approached the village, the sight brought both relief and sorrow. Smoke still curled from the charred ruins of some huts, and the baobab tree stood like a solemn guardian, its broad canopy shading what little remained. It was quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Abik stopped under the tree and turned to face the villagers. She swallowed hard, her heart thudding in her chest. The weight of what had happened was heavy, but so was the responsibility of what came next. This tree, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, has been here longer than any of us. Its roots run deep, even through the hardest ground. It has seen storms and droughts, but it still stands tall. Just like us, the villagers, young and old, gathered closer, their tired faces lifting to listen. We've been torn apart, Abik continued, her voice rising, but we are still here. We are still standing. They tried to break us, but they forgot that we are more than what they can see. We are stronger together, like the roots of this baobab tree, connected beneath the soil. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kwame, who stood beside her, nodded in quiet agreement. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes burned with the same resolve as Abik's. Ofori tugged at her hand. Tell them what we did, Abik, he whispered. Abik smiled down at him, then turned back to the group. We fought back, she said, her voice ringing out. Not with swords, but with courage. We used our wits, our strength, and our hearts. And we won. The villagers began to cheer softly, their voices growing louder until they echoed across the clearing. Abik felt a lump rise in her throat, but she held it down. There was still work to be done. They spent the day rebuilding what they could. Broken walls were patched, scattered belongings gathered. The baobab tree became the center of their efforts. Under its wide branches, they shared stories of their escape, each tale adding to the collective strength of the group. Ofori, sitting at Abik's side, looked up at the tree, "It's like it's watching over us," he said. "It is," a beak replied, "and we'll make sure it keeps doing that." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a beak stood under the baobab tree with a small sapling in her hands. The young tree, with its tender green leaves, had been growing in a quiet corner of the forest. Now, it was to have a new home. She knelt by the roots of the great baobab and dug a small hole in the soil. The villagers gathered around her, their faces illuminated by the glow of firelight. "This sapling," she said, her voice filled with determination, "will grow beside its mother. It will remind us that even when we are broken, we can grow again. It will remind us of today, of what we've lost and what we've gained." Carefully, she placed the sapling into the hole and covered its roots with earth. Ofori stepped forward, holding a small gourd of water. He poured it over the sapling's base, his small hand steady. The villagers clapped and cheered, their voices carrying a joy that felt almost forgotten.